Good evening. Uh, Gordon here. Posting this video within the Holy Shed, and it's something that I'll be using this coming Thursday at the Quakers Meeting House in Dundee. This Thursday at 7 o'clock, we've got an exploratory session into progressive Christianity and whether we wish to initiate new meetings around that subject. And one of the things I'll suggest we touch on is this subject of how do we use the Bible. So that's what I want to look at over the next few minutes, how we use the Bible. And a good question is, how did Jesus use the Bible? And in making reference to this, I'm drawing on that book by Rob Bell, What is the Bible? When we think about how Jesus used the Bible, within the synagogues, there would be scrolls, quite a number of scrolls on the Torah or the law, scrolls on the prophets, scrolls perhaps on the Psalms, the wisdom books, and so on. And there would be set readings, and people would be invited to read, provided they could read, of course. So it would be the men folk, and perhaps only certain of the men folk that would be invited to read. But there would be a discussion about what was read, exploring what was being said, perhaps at the time, and what was being said they thought to themselves, how they would work with it and give themselves an interpretation from the reading. So it was a collective process that they would go through to work out the meaning for themselves. There wasn't anybody who kind of was the gatekeeper to the wisdom of the Bible. They could work with it themselves, bringing their own experience of life to the book, and that would help them interpret it. So we have that aspect, and also Jesus, when he was reading, when we hear of this in Luke, he was reading from the prophet Isaiah and made reference to himself. It was a passage where, with reference to the sight for the blind, the healing for the sick, the freedom for the captives, and he was making reference to it for himself. That angered those in the synagogue at that place, and they wanted to do away with him. But that was his interpretation of the text, that it related to him. Some people would have thought it related to the king of Persia when the Israelites were in Babylon. Jesus was saying it's about him. Okay. Also, he interpreted or reinterpreted scripture. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbors, hate your enemies, all that sort of thing. And Jesus said, love your enemies. That's what I'm saying. So he gave fresh interpretations to the Bible in many ways. Think about what he said in relation to the Sabbath. Think of how he treated certain people that were ostracized or kept at a distance. Women, particularly women when menstruating. Then there would be Canaanites and Samaritans, all of them people out with the community of God, if you like, as seen by the Hebrews, but Jesus would bring them in. So Jesus was giving different interpretations to the scriptures, working with them in a new way, completely new way. So that gives us some insight. Now, a question that might help us also understand the Bible is this simple question: why did Jesus have to die? The very question I've asked presupposes that Jesus did have to die. In reality, he didn't. We look at the Gospels. Jesus chose to go to Jerusalem. He chose to be in the temple. He chose to upset the money changers and so on in the temple. And basically, what he did was he was attacking and critiquing the temple authorities, not just those who were carrying out the trade, which was necessary. He was critiquing the whole system of the temple. And he was asking for it, basically. He would go in the evenings to Bethany so that they couldn't be arrested until it got to the time when he was actually betrayed. He had said beforehand that he had to go. It was his purpose, his calling, if you like. And in the sense that when a person feels they can't walk away from something, when something is too bad and the calling is too important, they will go all the way. That's what it was like, I think, for Jesus. He had to go all the way. And in that sense, he felt he had no choice. But he could have set up a school to teach disciples. But no, he chose a very risky path, not just to die in a brutal way, but risk the whole end of his ministry. Yet he had lived a way of life, taught a way of life, and would die that way of life. So in a sense, Jesus didn't have to die, but chose. And there are interpretations within the Bible put on the death of Jesus, but we can read it for ourselves. We can work with the Bible just as we hear how Jesus and the Hebrews worked with the Bible. We can work with the Bible, with the Gospels, and question, what does the death of Jesus mean? Rather than just assume it means what we have been taught or what others in the Bible say. We can work with it for ourselves, with our understanding. And I think that is much more helpful and realistic. So there's a way of dealing with the Bible, and there's a way of not dealing with the Bible. For instance, you can think it's just dropped from heaven. That's exactly the wrong way to deal with the Bible. It's not inspired by God. God did not write the Bible. People wrote the Bible, and a whole variety of people over at least 1,000 years and probably longer wrote the Bible. And it isn't always what we think it is. Some of the letters of Paul were not written by Paul. There were at least 3 authors to the book of Isaiah. It wasn't Moses who wrote the first 5 books. They were written much later than people might have thought initially, and would have been written by scribes, perhaps from stories that would have already been circulating. So we need to bear in mind it's a document that has a varied history and also translated, copied, with many scribes maybe making their own amendments. The Gospel of Mark has an abrupt ending, but others have added to it. So you have all this kind of history to the book that we call the Bible. And we have to read it in a way that helps us understand where it's come from. So it's important, I think, to ask a question. Let me think. What is being said in the Bible? And to know what is being said, we should try to understand who is saying it to whom. So a commentary, a reliable one, can be useful to understand the context of books and their purpose, their time, their setting, and their purpose. What would the first hearers, and remember books would have been spoken, not read, that is, people would have heard. So what would the first hearers of the books of the Gospels say, make of them? We can but guess, but we can work out and have a fair idea. And then another question is what they are saying to us. We need to get rid of assumptions. We need to get rid of the doctrine, if you like, that is like a blinkers and forces us to read it sometimes in a particular way. Now, one example, just to finish with, is the parable of the talents. I think everybody will have heard of the parable of the talents. It's a story that Jesus told of the rich ruler going away and putting people in charge. And the people he put in charge, depending on the gospel you read, may have been servants or slaves. But there are people put in charge to run the estate, manage his affairs. And he gives them talents, which is money, 10, 5, 1, I think. And people would multiply that money. Now, there are some hints, strong hints within the parable. For instance, there is a phrase, the ruler reaped where he did not sow, which would indicate he was not a good ruler. The Hebrews would emphasize that those who sowed would reap. They were the ones whose labor had gone in, they would take the benefit. Somebody who would come along and reap where they had not sown would be a thief, an invader, an enemy. So the ruler isn't a good ruler. Very likely the ruler is suggested as Herod, though that wouldn't have been said openly. Herod Agrippa was one of the sons who took over from Herod the Great, would have been called to Rome, more than likely to be confirmed in his authority, and he would have put people in charge. Jesus makes a contrast by referring to them as slaves or servants. That probably would not have happened. It'd have been fairly significant individuals put in charge. And we hear that they're given money, resources, basically authority. And what's the question? How did they make more money? They would make more money because they'd raise more taxes. They would make more money because they would reap where they did not sow, meaning they would simply take crops and sell them. They would realize the collateral for loans and take land off people unfairly. They would do what was necessary, be exploitative, just like their ruler, but even more so because they were trying to justify themselves. So they were not really acting in a good way at all. And one person who gets one talent buries it. Why? Because that person isn't playing ball. That person is saying, no, I'm not going to carry on like this. I'm not going to exploit. I'm going to bury it and did not play the game. That is the courageous individual. That is the individual who's prepared to say, this isn't going to continue. That is the individual who's been courageous, standing their ground and saying this is wrong. That individual pays the price. The individual is a Christ-like figure, maybe even Jesus referring to himself, somebody who won't play ball with the exploitation of the day, who refuses to continue in that process. So when we look at the parable of the talents, we read it by asking, what is it really saying? And we can be clear when we read it for ourselves that some of those texts, verses I've mentioned, question the way we've assumed we read it. And when you think about it, the assumptions of reading it as people making money and using their talents and being responsible is the way the elite or the great and the good, if you like, would want the proletariat to read it, so that they would encourage people to take responsibility, they would encourage people to conform, they would encourage people to make money, because that would work in their favor. They wouldn't want to encourage people to say, no, this has to change. No, I'm not playing ball. They wouldn't want that reading at all. So we're given a reading that is all about conforming and maintaining an exploitation that the parable itself is denouncing. But that's what happens when the Bible becomes, acclimatized to the society of its day. And we're not reading it asking, what is it really saying? Not understanding its context, not understanding its power. And sometimes when we understand its context, we need to be able to read it thinking, what was Jesus' ministry about? Why are we hearing something in this parable that doesn't quite ring true? It's being read wrongly. So we can apply our own reason, our own thoughts, our own collective judgment, and come to an interpretation that is much more vital. And it begs a question of us in a much more powerful way. Do we stand up to exploitation? Are we prepared to bury the talent and say no? Are we prepared to take a risk and be a whistleblower? Are we prepared to stand up for justice against the crowd, out with the norm? That is the question asked of us. So you see, when we read the Bible, really listening, really trying to understand and discussing it, we begin to work with it in a much more productive and realistic way that shapes our lives in the present. Anyway, I hope you found that interesting. And for those who are coming on Thursday, we'll have a good discussion around this, I'm sure. Thanks. Bye for now.